What if persuasion isn't about convincing others, but about mastering a hidden code that makes them want to follow your lead? You're moments away from discovering why traditional influence tactics fail and learning the authentic approach that actually works. The Persuasion Code. Audiobook by Rowan March, published by Inner Impact Books. Introduction. Everything you know about persuasion is wrong. Right now, you're probably focused on what to say, how to say it, and which techniques will get others to do what you want. You've studied body language, practiced your pitch, and tried to project confidence. Yet somehow, the more you try to be persuasive, the more others seem to resist. You've felt that frustration. The sinking feeling when your carefully crafted argument falls flat. The struggle to get your team aligned with your vision. The pain of watching others get heard while your ideas go nowhere. You're doing everything the experts suggest, but something isn't clicking. Here's the breakthrough that will change everything. True persuasion isn't about becoming more powerful, it's about becoming more authentic. The most influential people rarely think about influence at all. Instead, they've mastered something far more fundamental: the ability to create environments where others persuade themselves. This audiobook will shatter every conventional wisdom about influence. Through these transformative chapters, you'll discover why showing vulnerability makes you more persuasive than displaying strength, why admitting uncertainty builds more credibility than claiming expertise, and why the best persuaders listen far more than they speak. You won't just learn theories. You'll get practical tools you can apply immediately to transform how others respond to you. By the time you finish this journey, you'll understand why the most influential people in your life never needed to study influence at all. More importantly, you'll have the exact framework to become one of them. Chapter 1. The Power Within. Your heart pounds as tension fills the conference room. The quarterly review meeting has spiraled into a heated debate, and every attempt to steer the conversation back on track only seems to make things worse. Your carefully prepared data points are met with skepticism. Your attempts to find middle ground are interpreted as weakness. When you try to assert authority, the resistance only intensifies. In this moment, you feel what so many feel: the maddening gap between knowing what needs to be done and being able to move others to action. But what if everything you're doing to be more persuasive is actually making you less influential? What if the real breakthrough isn't about mastering others, but mastering yourself? The truth that transforms everything. Your ability to influence others is directly proportional to your relationship with yourself. This isn't feel-good philosophy. It's the hidden pattern behind history's most profound leaders and influencers. Consider Nelson Mandela's journey. During his 27 years in prison on Robben Island, he faced a choice that would reshape not just his future, but his nation's. The natural response to imprisonment would be anger, resentment, and a hardening of the spirit. Instead, Mandela turned inward. He studied his guards, not to manipulate them, but to understand them. He learned Afrikaans, immersed himself in their culture, and most importantly, mastered his own emotional responses. As Ahmed Kathrada, his fellow prisoner, later revealed, Mandela would spend hours in quiet reflection, examining his own reactions and biases. When guards were particularly cruel, he would analyze his anger not to suppress it, but to understand it. This inner work transformed how others experienced him. Guards who came to break him found themselves changed by his presence. His influence grew not through technique or position, but through the depth of his self-mastery. The key insight wasn't just that Mandela controlled his emotions. It was that he developed such deep self-awareness that he could choose his responses rather than being driven by them. This inner freedom created outer authority that no prison could contain. This same principle plays out in everyday settings, though we often miss it. Think about the people who influence you most deeply. They likely aren't the ones with the most polished presentations or clever persuasion tactics. They're the ones who remain steady under pressure, who listen without defensiveness, who can acknowledge their own limitations while standing firmly in their truth. Alexa, a product manager at a fast-growing startup, discovered this truth through experience. Her natural introversion made her feel disadvantaged in a culture that seemed to reward loud voices and aggressive advocacy. She tried forcing herself to be more assertive, to speak up more in meetings, to project confidence she didn't feel. The results were mixed at best. The breakthrough came when she stopped trying to be someone else and instead focused on deepening her self-awareness. She started noting her emotional triggers in difficult conversations. She examined her tendency to withdraw when challenged. Instead of trying to change these patterns, she first worked to understand them. A fascinating shift occurred. As Alexa developed a more grounded relationship with herself, her quiet confidence began to impact others. Team members started seeking her input, not because she demanded attention, but because they sensed her deep attention to both herself and them. Her influence grew not through technique, but through presence. The path to this kind of influence begins with a simple but powerful practice: emotional self-observation. Before you can master any external situation, you must first become aware of your internal landscape. This doesn't mean controlling or changing your emotions. It means developing the capacity to notice them without being controlled by them. Your challenge for this week: choose one typically triggering situation, a critical meeting, a difficult conversation, or a moment of conflict. Instead of focusing on what you'll say or do, commit to simply observing your internal responses. What emotions arise? What physical sensations accompany them? What automatic reactions do you notice? Don't judge or try to change anything. Simply observe with curiosity, as if you're watching an interesting experiment unfold. Chapter 2: The Authenticity Advantage. According to recent neuroscience research, the human brain can detect inauthentic behavior in as little as 0.07 seconds, faster than we can consciously process a face. Yet how many hours do you spend rehearsing presentations, practicing power poses, or carefully crafting an image of confidence you don't quite feel? The energy devoted to appearing strong might be exactly what's making you weak. Think about your last high-stakes interaction. Maybe it was a crucial pitch, a difficult conversation with your team, or a challenging negotiation. How much of your mental bandwidth was consumed by managing others' perceptions? By the end, did you feel exhausted not from the work itself, but from maintaining the facade? The paradox that changes everything. The more energy you spend trying to appear powerful, the less influential you become. Your brain is so occupied with impression management that it can't fully engage with others. Meanwhile, their subconscious minds are picking up every microsignal of inauthenticity, triggering instinctive distrust. Brené Brown's journey illuminates this principle perfectly. Before becoming one of the world's most influential speakers on vulnerability and leadership, she was a research professor struggling to connect with audiences. Despite her extensive knowledge and careful preparation, her early presentations often fell flat. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: her own research data. While studying shame and vulnerability, Brown discovered a pattern that challenged everything she thought she knew about influence. The people who had the most profound impact on others weren't those who projected perfection or authority. They were those who had the courage to show up authentically, acknowledging their struggles while maintaining clear boundaries. This insight forced her to confront her own speaking style. She had been approaching presentations like armor, using academic language and polished delivery to protect herself from judgment. The turning point came during a small workshop, where, exhausted from maintaining the facade, she simply shared her genuine struggles with the material. The response was immediate and powerful. The audience leaned in, engagement soared, and her message landed with unprecedented impact. What Brown discovered wasn't just about public speaking. It was about the fundamental nature of human influence. When we try to appear more knowledgeable, confident, or powerful than we feel, we create a subtle but pervasive disconnect. Others may not consciously identify what's wrong, but their mirror neurons register the misalignment between our words and our authentic state. This explains why some of the most seemingly qualified people struggle to influence others, while those with less impressive credentials but greater authenticity often have outsized impact. It's not about lowering standards or abandoning expertise. It's about integrating that expertise with genuine human connection. The science behind this is fascinating. Research shows that when people attempt to project confidence they don't feel, their vocal patterns show microscopic variations that listeners unconsciously interpret as dishonest. However, when speakers acknowledge their uncertainty while maintaining clear conviction about their core message, audience trust and retention significantly increase. This principle transforms how we approach influence in every domain. Instead of trying to eliminate doubt or project unwavering certainty, we can learn to integrate our human complexity into more powerful communication. Jordan, an enterprise sales professional, discovered this truth the hard way. After years of following traditional sales training, always appear confident, never admit weakness, handle every objection with a prepared response, his results had plateaued. Worse, he felt increasingly disconnected from his work and his clients. The transformation began when he decided to experiment with radical honesty. During a high-stakes pitch to a potential client, instead of glossing over a limitation in his product, he addressed it directly. "This isn't actually the strongest part of our solution. Let me explain why we designed it this way, and you can decide if that aligns with your needs." He braced for rejection. Instead, the client leaned forward with genuine interest. The conversation shifted from a guarded dance of pitch and skepticism to a real exploration of how to solve business problems. That meeting not only resulted in a sale, but began a pattern of deeper, more authentic client relationships that transformed his entire approach. The key wasn't that Jordan started pointing out flaws. It was that he stopped spending energy maintaining a facade of perfection. This freed his attention to truly listen, understand, and connect. His influence grew, not despite his authenticity, but because of it. This approach requires a fundamental shift in how we think about professional interactions. Instead of asking, "How do I appear more confident?" we must ask, "How do I become more integrated?" This means understanding that authenticity isn't about sharing everything. It's about ensuring that what you do share is genuinely true. Recognizing that influence comes not from having all the answers, but from being real about what you know and don't know. Learning to distinguish between authentic vulnerability that builds connection and oversharing that erodes professional trust. The path to this kind of authentic influence begins with a simple but profound shift. Start paying attention to moments when you're wearing a professional mask. Notice situations where you feel compelled to appear more certain, more confident, or more knowledgeable than you really are. Don't judge these moments. They're natural responses to professional pressure. Simply begin to observe them with curiosity. Chapter 3. The Power of Deep Listening. Think back to the last time someone made you feel truly seen and understood. Perhaps it was over coffee with a friend, during a meaningful conversation with a mentor, or even a surprising moment with a stranger. Remember how their complete attention felt like a warm light focused entirely on you. How their questions weren't just polite exchanges, but genuine expressions of interest that helped you understand yourself better. How time seemed to slow down as you felt the rare freedom to fully express your thoughts without judgment or interruption. Now contrast that with most of your daily interactions. How often do you catch yourself formulating your response while someone else is still speaking? How many times have you nodded along while your mind wanders to your growing to-do list? The difference between these experiences isn't just about attention. It's about the fundamental nature of human connection and influence. Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, revolutionized not just quantum mechanics, but also our understanding of how humans learn and connect. While most scientists of his era focused on proving their brilliance, Feynman became legendary for his ability to make complex ideas accessible to anyone. His secret wasn't simplification, it was profound curiosity. In his teaching at Caltech, Feynman would often spend entire class periods exploring a single student's question, not because he couldn't explain the answer quickly, but because he was genuinely fascinated by how different minds approached problems. He would ask probing questions about their thinking process, often discovering that their confusion revealed gaps in conventional physics explanations that even experts had overlooked. This approach transformed his lectures from mere information transfer into collaborative explorations. Students who struggled with physics in other classes found themselves making breakthrough insights, not because Feynman taught differently, but because he listened differently. His genuine curiosity about their perspective created an environment where learning happened naturally. The same principle that made Feynman an extraordinary teacher makes deep listening the foundation of genuine influence. When someone feels truly heard, their defensive barriers lower, their thinking becomes more flexible, and they become dramatically more open to new perspectives. Neuroscience confirms this through studies of neural synchronization. When someone feels deeply understood, their brain activity begins to mirror that of the listener, creating a state of enhanced receptivity and trust. This explains why forcing your point of view often creates resistance, while genuine curiosity tends to dissolve it. Morgan, a corporate mediator, discovered this truth during a seemingly impossible negotiation between two technology companies locked in a bitter intellectual property dispute. Traditional mediation techniques had failed, and both sides were entrenched in their positions, armed with binders of evidence and legal arguments. Instead of pushing for compromise, Morgan took an unusual approach. She spent the first 3 hours doing nothing but asking questions and reflecting back what she heard, with genuine curiosity about each side's deeper concerns. No problem solving, no suggestions, just pure exploration and understanding. Initially, both parties were frustrated by this approach, eager to prove their points and reach a resolution. But as they experienced being truly heard, something shifted. Their rigid positions began to soften. New possibilities emerged not from Morgan's suggestions, but from the parties themselves, who could finally think creatively once they felt their core concerns were understood. The breakthrough came when one CEO, after feeling truly heard about his fears for his company's future, spontaneously proposed a joint venture that would benefit both organizations, an option that hadn't been on the table during months of previous negotiations. The solution emerged not from clever mediation techniques, but from the space created by deep listening. This reveals a counterintuitive truth about influence. The less you try to persuade, and the more you seek to understand, the more persuasive you become. This isn't about manipulation or technique. It's about creating conditions where others feel safe enough to change their own minds. Your challenge for the next 24 hours is simple but profound. Choose one important conversation and commit to absolute curiosity. For 10 full minutes, you can only ask questions and reflect back what you hear. No giving advice, no sharing similar experiences, no subtle steering toward your perspective. Just pure, genuine curiosity about another person's experience and viewpoint. Notice not just what they say, but how they respond to being truly heard. This isn't just an exercise in listening. It's your first step toward mastering the art of authentic influence. Chapter 4. The Trust Paradox. Have you ever noticed how the moment someone tells you to trust them, your guard automatically goes up? It's like watching a salesperson flash their brightest smile while insisting they're giving you the best deal possible. Something in your gut immediately signals caution. This isn't just your personal skepticism at work. It's a sophisticated defense mechanism wired into the human brain through millennia of evolution, and it reveals a fascinating paradox. The harder someone tries to appear trustworthy, the less we trust them. Think about your own experiences. When you're in a situation where gaining trust is crucial, perhaps a job interview, an important presentation, or a difficult conversation with a loved one, you might find yourself unconsciously adjusting your posture, carefully selecting your words, or trying to project an image of complete competence and reliability. Yet somehow, these very efforts to appear more trustworthy often create the opposite effect. Others sense something slightly off, a disconnect between your outer presentation and inner reality. This brings us to one of the most remarkable corporate transformations in recent business history, led by Harvard Business School professor Francis Fry. In 2017, Uber was in crisis. The company's culture had become toxic. Trust was shattered both internally and externally, and the future of the ride-sharing giant hung in the balance. The board made an unusual choice. Rather than bringing in a traditional corporate turnaround expert, they recruited Fry, whose groundbreaking research on trust had identified a fundamental truth that most leaders miss. Through extensive research and real-world application, Fry had discovered that trust isn't a single quality, but a triangle of three essential elements: authenticity, logic, and empathy. When any one of these elements is missing or compromised, trust fails. But here's the crucial insight. Most people and organizations focus on the wrong element. They try to build trust by demonstrating competence, logic, when their real trust deficit might be in authenticity or empathy. At Uber, Fry noticed that many leaders were highly competent and could articulate logical solutions, but they struggled with authenticity and empathy. They were so focused on appearing strong and capable that they created distance between themselves and their teams. Her solution was counterintuitive. She encouraged leaders to be more open about their challenges, to acknowledge areas where they needed help, and to show genuine curiosity about their employees' experiences. The results were transformative. As leaders began sharing their own struggles and uncertainties, employees felt safer doing the same. Problems that had been hidden began surfacing where they could be addressed. Innovation flourished because people no longer feared admitting when they needed help or had made a mistake. The company's culture shifted not through new policies or procedures, but through a fundamental change in how people related to each other. This reveals a profound truth about trust. It's not built through perfection, but through genuine human connection. When we try to appear flawless, we actually create distance. It's our willingness to be seen as imperfect that allows others to relate to us and ultimately to trust us. The neuroscience behind this is fascinating. When we encounter someone trying too hard to appear trustworthy, our anterior cingulate cortex, the brain's conflict detector, becomes more active. This same region lights up when we detect inconsistencies or potential threats. In contrast, when we witness genuine vulnerability, our mirror neuron system activates, creating emotional resonance and connection. This is why a leader who honestly admits to not having all the answers often engenders more trust than one who projects unwavering certainty. Devon, a newly appointed team leader at a company, discovered this truth when she inherited a department plagued by low morale and high turnover. Her predecessor had maintained an image of complete control and expertise, never admitting to mistakes or uncertainty. Team members had learned to hide their own struggles, leading to missed deadlines and quality issues that no one felt safe discussing. In her first team meeting, Devon took a risk. Instead of presenting a confident plan to fix everything, she acknowledged her own nervousness about the role and admitted that she didn't have all the answers. She shared a story about a significant mistake she'd made in her previous position and what she'd learned from it. Then, she asked team members to help her understand their challenges and perspectives. The room was silent at first. People weren't used to this kind of openness from leadership. But gradually, one person shared a struggle they'd been having with a particular project. Another admitted to feeling overwhelmed by competing priorities. Instead of offering immediate solutions, Devon listened deeply and asked questions that helped the team explore these challenges together. Over the next few months, this pattern of honest communication transformed the department. Team members began collaborating more effectively because they no longer felt they had to pretend to have everything under control. Problems were caught earlier because people felt safe raising concerns. Innovation increased because experimentation and the possibility of failure was now acceptable. Most importantly, trust flourished not because Devon proved her competence, though she was indeed highly capable, but because she created an environment where people could be genuine with each other. Her willingness to be vulnerable made it safe for others to do the same. This brings us to your challenge for the next week. Identify one area in your professional or personal life where you've been trying to maintain an image of perfection. Choose a small way to let that mask slip, perhaps by admitting uncertainty about a decision, asking for help with something you're struggling with, or sharing a relevant mistake you've made in the past. Pay attention to how others respond when you step back from projecting perfect competence and instead demonstrate genuine humanity. You might discover that what you thought was a weakness actually becomes your greatest source of connection and influence. Chapter 5. The Silent Language of Influence. You're sitting across from someone in what should be a routine meeting, but something feels off. The words coming out of their mouth say one thing, but a nagging sensation in your gut tells you another story entirely. Their smile seems a fraction too wide, their shoulders slightly too stiff, their fingers drumming an irregular pattern on the table. Before you've consciously processed any of these details, your brain has already assembled them into a clear message. This person is deeply uncomfortable with what they're telling you. This isn't intuition or some mystical sixth sense. It's your brain doing what it evolved to do over millions of years. Long before humans developed language, our survival depended on our ability to read subtle signals from others. This ancient warning system hasn't disappeared in our modern world of words and logic. It's still operating constantly, processing an estimated 10,000 nonverbal cues in just a single minute of interaction. Joe Navarro discovered the power of this silent language in the most high-stakes environment imaginable. As an FBI counterintelligence agent interviewing suspected spies. Early in his career, Navarro noticed something fascinating. The traditional methods of lie detection, focused on obvious signs like avoiding eye contact or touching one's face, proved unreliable. What proved far more revealing were the subtle, unconscious behaviors people couldn't control. During one crucial investigation, Navarro was interviewing a suspect who maintained perfect eye contact and spoke with unwavering confidence. Traditional deception indicators suggested complete truthfulness, but Navarro noticed something else. Whenever specific locations were mentioned, the suspect's feet would quickly point toward the door, a primitive escape response they weren't even aware of. This tells led investigators to uncover crucial evidence at those locations, ultimately proving the suspect's involvement in espionage. This experience led Navarro to revolutionize the FBI's approach to behavioral analysis. Rather than focusing on conscious behaviors that people could control, he developed a system based on reading honest signals. involuntary responses controlled by the limbic brain that reveal true emotional states. These signals are universal across cultures because they're hardwired into our nervous system, making them far more reliable than words alone. The science behind this is fascinating. Your limbic brain processes emotional information about 200 milliseconds faster than your conscious mind can form thoughts. This means your body often reacts to situations before you're consciously aware of your own feelings. When someone's words don't match their involuntary signals, this creates what psychologists call nonverbal leakage, subtle inconsistencies that trigger our threat detection system. What's most remarkable is that you're already an expert at reading these signals. You just might not trust what you're seeing. Studies show that when people are asked to consciously identify deception, their accuracy hovers around chance. But when they're asked to make rapid, intuitive judgments about someone's truthfulness, their accuracy jumps significantly. The problem isn't that we can't read nonverbal cues. It's that we've learned to doubt our natural ability to do so. This brings us to the practical application of these insights. The goal isn't to become a human lie detector. That's both unrealistic and ethically questionable. Instead, developing your awareness of nonverbal communication allows you to better understand and respond to the emotional undercurrents in any interaction. Riley, a customer service manager at a rapidly growing tech company, discovered this truth when facing an unprecedented surge in escalated complaints. Despite her team following all the standard protocols and saying all the right things, customers seemed to become more agitated rather than less during support calls. During one particularly challenging call, Riley noticed something interesting. While listening to a recording of the conversation, she paid attention not to the words, but to the subtle shifts in the customer's tone and pacing. She realized that whenever her team member offered solutions, there was a slight pause in the customer's breathing, a sign of suppressed frustration that went unaddressed because it wasn't verbally expressed. This observation led Riley to implement a new approach. She trained her team to listen for these subtle cues, changes in breathing patterns, micropauses, shifts in vocal tone, and to respond to the emotional message rather than just the verbal content. When they noticed signs of suppressed frustration, they would pause their solution offering and simply acknowledge the customer's emotional state. "I hear how frustrating this situation is for you." The results were remarkable. Escalation rates dropped by 60% within 2 months. Customer satisfaction scores improved dramatically, but most surprisingly, average call times actually decreased. By addressing the emotional undercurrent early, they prevented the buildup of frustration that had been leading to prolonged conflicts. What Riley's team discovered was the power of emotional attunement, the ability to read and respond to the subtle signals that reveal how someone is really feeling. This skill isn't about manipulation. It's about creating genuine connection by acknowledging the full spectrum of human communication. The key to developing this skill lies in learning to trust your natural ability to read these signals while developing a more conscious awareness of specific patterns. Start by focusing on these 3 fundamental areas of nonverbal communication. Baseline behavior. Every person has a normal pattern of behavior when they're comfortable and relaxed. Changes from this baseline are more revealing than any single behavior in isolation. Notice how people typically sit, move, and gesture when at ease. Cluster reading. Nonverbal signals rarely occur in isolation. Instead of focusing on single behaviors, look for clusters of signals that tell a consistent story. Crossed arms alone might mean nothing, but combined with leaning away and minimal eye contact, they suggest discomfort or disagreement. Comfort versus discomfort. Rather than trying to spot specific emotions, first learn to recognize the basic signs of comfort: relaxed posture, open gestures, smooth movements, versus discomfort, tension, self-soothing behaviors, jerky or restricted movements. Chapter 6. The hidden language of motivation. Every time you've tried to motivate someone through rewards or consequences, you've likely been working against human nature itself. A groundbreaking meta-analysis of over 100 studies revealed a startling truth. Traditional incentives decreased intrinsic motivation by up to 40%. The more you try to control someone's behavior through external means, the more likely they are to resist, even when the proposed action would benefit them directly. Think about the last time you tried to influence someone's behavior. Maybe you offered incentives, laid out logical arguments, or carefully explained all the benefits they'd receive. Yet somehow, the more compelling your case seemed, the stronger their resistance grew. This isn't a failure of your persuasion skills. It's evidence that you're speaking the wrong motivational language entirely. The story of Muhammad Yunus and the birth of microfinance perfectly illustrates this principle. When Yunus first encountered the crushing poverty in Bangladesh's villages, conventional banking wisdom suggested that poor people were unmotivated and high-risk borrowers. Traditional banks refused to lend to them, believing that without collateral or the threat of consequences, there would be no incentive to repay loans. But Yunus observed something different. In one village, he met a group of women making bamboo stools. Despite their incredible work ethic, they remained trapped in poverty because they had to borrow money for raw materials at such high rates that they could barely break even. The conventional banking system saw them as unmotivated risks. Yunus saw people driven by deep aspirations for their families' futures, held back not by lack of motivation, but by lack of opportunity. This insight led him to create Grameen Bank, built on a radical premise: trust in people's intrinsic motivation rather than external controls. Instead of collateral, he used social connections. Instead of threatening consequences, he appealed to borrowers' desire for community respect and self-reliance. The results shattered all expectations. Loan repayment rates exceeded 95%, far higher than traditional banks. What Yunus discovered was a fundamental truth about human motivation. People are driven more by internal factors: autonomy, mastery, purpose, and social connection, than by external rewards or punishments. The traditional banking system failed because it tried to impose motivation from the outside. Grameen Bank succeeded because it tapped into motivation that was already there. The science behind this is fascinating. Research in behavioral psychology has identified 3 core human needs that drive internal motivation: autonomy, the desire to direct our own lives; competence, the urge to master skills and grow; and relatedness, the need to connect meaningfully with others. When these needs are met, people naturally engage and persist. When these needs are thwarted, even by well-intentioned attempts to motivate through rewards or consequences, resistance naturally follows. Cameron discovered this truth through a challenging journey with her teenage daughter. Traditional parenting approaches of rules, rewards, and consequences had created an escalating power struggle over homework and grades. Every attempt to motivate through external means, taking away phone privileges, offering rewards for good grades, implementing strict study schedules, only seemed to increase her daughter's resistance. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. One evening, instead of focusing on grades or study habits, Cameron simply sat with her daughter and asked about her dreams for the future. As her daughter hesitantly opened up about her interest in marine biology and her fear of not being smart enough for science, Cameron realized something profound. Her daughter's resistance wasn't about motivation. It was about fear, self-doubt, and a need for autonomy. Cameron shifted her approach entirely. Instead of trying to control her daughter's studying, she focused on supporting her daughter's interest in marine science, watching documentaries together, visiting aquariums, connecting her with a marine biologist for mentoring. Most importantly, She stopped trying to manage her daughter's homework routine, instead expressing confidence in her ability to figure out what worked best for her. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was remarkable. Without external pressure, her daughter began developing her own study habits, driven by genuine interest rather than obligation. Her grades improved not because of rewards or consequences, but because she had connected her schoolwork to her own goals and values. This story illustrates a crucial truth about influence. True motivation can't be imposed from outside. It can only be uncovered and supported. When you try to motivate others through external means, you often suppress the very internal drives that would naturally lead to sustained engagement and effort. Here's your challenge for today. Think of one situation where you're currently trying to influence someone's behavior. Instead of focusing on how to motivate them, ask yourself these questions. What deeper needs might be driving their current behavior? What aspirations or values could connect with the change you're hoping to see? What fears or doubts might be creating resistance? Write down your insights, then approach your next conversation with curiosity about these deeper motivations, rather than arguments about what they should do. Chapter 7: The Art of Non-Resistance. When you encounter resistance, your instinct is to push harder. It's a natural response, deeply wired into your survival programming. Meet force with greater force. But what if everything you know about handling opposition is exactly what keeps you stuck in endless power struggles? Picture two martial artists squaring off. The novice tenses up, muscles rigid, trying to overpower their opponent through sheer force. The master stays loose, relaxed, almost fluid. When the novice attacks with full strength, the master doesn't resist. They blend with the incoming energy, redirecting it so smoothly that the attacker's own momentum becomes their downfall. This isn't just a martial arts principle, it's a fundamental truth about human influence that changes everything once you truly understand it. The physics of resistance operates the same way in human psychology as it does in martial arts. When you push against someone's position, they instinctively push back harder. The more forcefully you argue, the more deeply they entrench in their opposing view. Each attempt to overcome resistance through power only generates more resistance in return. Rosa Parks embodied this principle on December 1st, 1955, though few understand the true sophistication of her approach. Popular history often portrays her act of remaining seated on that Montgomery bus as a simple refusal, but the reality reveals a masterclass in strategic non-resistance. Parks wasn't the first person to challenge bus segregation. Others had tried confrontational approaches without lasting impact. What made Parks different was her preparation and her precise understanding of how to transform resistance into momentum for change. As a trained civil rights activist and NAACP secretary, Parks had spent years studying methods of peaceful resistance. She understood that the power of her action would come not from fighting the system head-on, but from revealing its inherent contradictions through quiet dignity. When the bus driver demanded she move, Parks didn't argue or raise her voice. She simply asked, "Why do you push us around?" Her calm question carried more power than any shouted protest. The police came, and Parks maintained her composure, remaining polite while firmly holding her ground. She later recalled, "When that white driver stepped back toward us, when he waved his hand and ordered us up and out of our seats, I felt a determination cover my body like a quilt on a winter night." This wasn't passive submission. It was strategic non-resistance. By refusing to engage in confrontation while also refusing to comply with injustice, Parks created a moment that transformed resistance into unstoppable momentum for change. The system was prepared to handle angry protesters. It had no defense against dignified non-resistance. The scientific principle behind this approach lies in psychological reactance theory. When people feel their freedom threatened, they instinctively move to protect it. Direct attempts to change someone's behavior or beliefs trigger this threat response, strengthening their commitment to the opposing position. But non-resistance short-circuits this defensive reaction, creating space for voluntary change. This plays out every day in boardrooms, living rooms, and classrooms around the world. Taylor, a project manager at a growing tech company, discovered this truth when introducing a major system overhaul. Despite careful planning and clear benefits, the project faced fierce resistance, particularly from Michael, a veteran engineer who seemed determined to fight every proposed change. Taylor's initial response was to counter Michael's objections with more data, more logical arguments, and more forceful presentations. Each attempt to overcome the resistance only seemed to strengthen it. Team meetings became battlegrounds of competing presentations and escalating tension. The turning point came when Taylor stopped trying to overcome Michael's resistance and instead began moving with it. In their next interaction, instead of defending against Michael's concerns, Taylor leaned into them. "You've been raising some crucial points about implementation risks. I'd like to understand these issues more deeply. Would you be willing to walk me through your concerns in detail?" This simple shift from pushing against to moving with changed everything. Michael, prepared for another argument, found himself instead in a collaborative exploration of the project's challenges. His expertise, previously deployed as weapons of resistance, naturally evolved into tools for solving problems. Taylor took it further, inviting Michael to help redesign critical aspects of the implementation plan. "Your experience spotting potential failure points is exactly what this project needs. Would you be willing to help us build something more robust?" Within weeks, Michael transformed from the project's biggest critic to its most valuable contributor. The same energy that had fueled his resistance now drove improvements and innovations. The key wasn't in overpowering opposition, but in redirecting its momentum toward a shared goal. This pattern reveals a crucial truth about influence. Resistance contains energy, and energy can be redirected. When you fight resistance directly, you waste energy and strengthen opposition. When you blend with resistance, you can guide its energy toward positive change. The practical application of this principle requires 3 key shifts in your approach. First, recognize that resistance often carries wisdom. When someone pushes back against your ideas or requests, they're telling you something important about their needs, fears, or values. Instead of trying to overcome these signals, get curious about what they're telling you. Second, understand that resistance is energy-seeking expression. People resist because they care about something: their autonomy, their values, their sense of security. This energy of caring can become a powerful ally if you learn to align with it rather than oppose it. Third, master the art of strategic non-resistance. This doesn't mean becoming passive or giving up your objectives. It means learning to accomplish your goals without triggering defensive reactions in others. The next time you encounter strong opposition, resist your instinct to push harder. Instead, try this simple but powerful approach. Take a breath, relax your psychological stance, and get genuinely curious about the resistance. Ask questions that help you understand not just what someone is opposing, but what they're trying to protect or achieve. Your challenge for today: identify one situation where you're facing significant resistance. Instead of planning how to overcome it, spend 10 minutes writing down everything you can learn from it. What values or concerns might be driving the opposition? How could you align your goals with these underlying needs? Then, in your next interaction, practice strategic non-resistance by leading with curiosity rather than arguments. Remember, true influence isn't about being stronger than resistance. It's about being more fluid than resistance expects. Chapter 8. The frame defines the picture. Have you ever noticed how the exact same situation can feel completely different based on how you think about it? Right now, you're investing time listening to this audiobook. One frame sees this as precious minutes spent away from urgent tasks piling up. Another frame recognizes this as strategic preparation that will multiply your effectiveness in everything you do. Same reality, radically different experience. This isn't just clever wordplay. It's a fundamental principle that shapes every aspect of your life and influence. The frame through which you view a situation determines not just how you feel about it, but what actions become possible and how others respond to you. Think. A major project faces unexpected delays and budget overruns. Frame 1. This is a disaster that threatens our deadlines and relationships. Your body tenses, stress hormones surge, and your mind races toward damage control. Frame 2. This is valuable early warning data that lets us strengthen our approach before bigger issues emerge. Your breathing stays steady, your mind stays clear, and creative solutions begin to surface. Nothing about the external situation has changed, but everything about how you experience and respond to it has transformed. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s genius lay not just in his courage or oratory skill, but in his masterful understanding of framing's power to reshape reality. When he assumed leadership of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, the civil rights struggle was widely framed as a regional dispute over local customs. This frame kept the movement contained and limited its support. King systematically reframed the struggle, not by changing the facts, but by placing them in a larger moral context that resonated with universal human values. His letter from Birmingham jail masterfully reframed civil rights from a legal issue to a moral imperative, from a regional concern to a national soul-searching, from a political movement to a spiritual awakening. When 8 Alabama clergymen criticized his actions as unwise and untimely, King didn't argue within their frame of proper timing and procedures. Instead, he expanded the frame. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. This new frame transformed the discussion from tactical disagreements to fundamental human interconnection. The power of King's framing became evident in how it shifted public perception. When people saw civil rights protests through the frame of law and order, they focused on technical violations of local ordinances. When they saw the same events through King's frame of moral dignity and universal human rights, they recognized the profound courage of peaceful protesters facing fire hoses and police dogs. This wasn't manipulation. It was illumination. King didn't distort reality. He helped people see it more completely. The same events viewed through a larger frame revealed deeper truths that had always been present but gone unnoticed. The science behind framing's power lies in how our brains process information. Research shows that we never experience raw reality. Our brain constructs our experience by fitting sensory input into existing mental frameworks. Change the frame, and you literally change how the brain processes and responds to the same information. Adrian discovered this transformative power when COVID-19 threatened to destroy the restaurant he'd spent 15 years building. Initial framing saw only disaster, forced closure, lost revenue, laid off staff. Every news report reinforced this frame of crisis and survival. But something shifted when Adrian forced himself to ask, what if this isn't just a crisis to survive, but an opportunity to reinvent? This new frame didn't deny the challenges, but opened his mind to possibilities invisible in the crisis frame. Through this lens of reinvention, Adrian saw that his loyal customers weren't just missing his food. They were missing the experience of connection his restaurant provided. This realization led to Kitchen Together, virtual cooking classes where customers could prepare his signature dishes alongside him in their own homes. What started as a stopgap measure evolved into a thriving new business model. Customers who'd never had time for sit-down dining now connected with Adrian's cuisine through interactive online experiences. Corporate teams booked private classes for remote team building. The restaurant's reach expanded beyond geographical limitations. The same circumstances viewed through a different frame revealed opportunities that had been there all along. Adrian's story isn't about positive thinking or denying reality. It's about how frames determine which aspects of reality become visible and actionable. The practical application of framing power requires developing 3 core skills. Frame awareness means learning to recognize the frames you're currently using and how they shape your perception and possibilities. Notice how your energy and creativity shift when you frame a difficult conversation as confrontation versus collaboration. Frame flexibility involves deliberately trying on different frames to see what they reveal. A project setback viewed through frames of failure, feedback, or plot twist opens very different paths forward. Frame creation is the advanced skill of constructing new frames that better serve your goals and values. Instead of choosing between existing frames, you learn to build frames that transform how you and others see situations. This isn't about finding one right frame, but developing the ability to shift frames intentionally. Each frame reveals different aspects of reality and enables different responses. The more frames you can access and switch between, the more choices become available. See Maria, a team leader facing resistance to change initiatives. Her initial frame saw this as opposition to be overcome, leading to pushing harder and increasing tension. Reframing the situation as valuable feedback about implementation gaps transformed her approach. Instead of trying to overcome resistance, she began exploring what it could teach her. The same team members, now viewed through a frame of essential sources of implementation wisdom rather than obstacles to change, began offering crucial insights that strengthened the initiatives. The resistance didn't disappear. It transformed into constructive collaboration when viewed through a different frame. Your challenge today is to practice intentional reframing. Choose one situation in your life that feels stuck or challenging. Write down your current frame, how you're thinking about and explaining this situation to yourself. Then create 3 completely different frames for viewing the same situation. For each new frame, note: what aspects of the situation become more visible in this frame? What new possibilities or actions does this frame suggest? How do your feelings about the situation shift with this frame? The goal isn't to find the right frame, but to experience how different frames reveal different aspects of reality and enable different responses. Your power to influence situations often lies not in changing external circumstances, but in choosing the frames through which you and others view them. Chapter 9. The Hidden Pattern of Influence. What was the last story that completely absorbed you, making you forget everything else around you? Think about that moment when you were so invested in the narrative that time seemed to stop. Now, what if you discovered that this same magnetic pull that kept you turning pages or watching just one more episode holds the key to becoming remarkably persuasive? Most people approach influence like a debate, armed with facts and logic. But master persuaders understand a deeper truth. Human beings are wired for story. Our brains literally sync with storytellers, releasing neurochemicals that create emotional investment and trust. This isn't just theory, it's hardwired into our neural architecture. Walt Disney grasped this fundamental truth decades before neuroscience could explain it. In 1937, when Disney proposed creating Snow White, the first feature-length animated film, industry experts called it Disney's folly. They argued that audiences wouldn't sit through a lengthy cartoon, using market research and financial projections to prove their point. But Disney understood something his critics missed: the power of emotional journey over logical argument. He didn't try to convince audiences they should watch a long animated film. Instead, he created a story that made them forget they were watching animation at all. Snow White succeeded not because Disney won the argument about animation's viability, but because he tapped into universal emotional patterns that bypass conscious resistance. Disney's insight went beyond entertainment. During World War II, when the U.S. government needed to explain complex military concepts to troops, they turned to Disney Studios. Rather than creating dry training manuals, Disney's team crafted narrative-driven educational films that achieved unprecedented knowledge retention rates. The same principles that made Snow White compelling were making military protocols memorable. The science behind this reveals why story-based influence works so consistently. When we process facts and figures, only our language centers activate. But when we engage with story, our brains mirror the emotional and sensory experiences being described. We don't just understand intellectually, we feel and experience viscerally. This explains why telling someone they should change rarely works, while showing them a story of transformation often does. The difference lies in how the brain processes and integrates the information. Think of this as emotional choreography rather than logical progression. Just as a dance moves through distinct rhythms and energies, effective influence flows through emotional beats that align with natural human psychological patterns. Quinn discovered this power when traditional advocacy methods failed to protect her neighborhood park from development. Her presentations at city council meetings, packed with environmental impact data and property value statistics, gained polite nods but no action. Everything changed when she shifted from presenting arguments to sharing stories. Instead of citing playground usage statistics, she invited council members to hear about 8-year-old Michael, whose only safe place to play basketball was this park. Rather than projecting graphs about green space benefits, she shared how elderly residents gathered there every morning, forming connections that kept isolation at bay. Quinn wasn't manipulating. She was illuminating the human reality that raw data couldn't capture. By the end of her campaign, council members weren't just voting to save a park, they were protecting a vital community heartbeat they could now feel and understand. The key lies in understanding that every persuasive interaction has an emotional arc. Just as stories have a beginning that hooks interest, a middle that builds investment, and an end that delivers satisfaction, influential conversations follow similar patterns. Start with connection before content. Build shared context before proposing solutions. Let tension develop naturally before offering resolution. These aren't manipulative tactics. They're alignment with how human beings naturally process and integrate new ideas. Here's your challenge. Before your next important conversation, map out its emotional journey. What's the opening hook that will create genuine engagement? How will you build investment before asking for change? What's the satisfying resolution that makes the journey worthwhile? Don't script dialogue. Script the emotional flow that makes natural agreement possible. Chapter 10. The Power of Strategic Silence. You're sitting across the negotiation table, pulse quickening as millions hang in the balance. The other party has just made their offer, and every fiber of your being screams to respond, to counter, to fill this uncomfortable void with words. But what if your most powerful move right now is to say absolutely nothing? The instinct to fill silence is deeply human. In moments of tension, we rush to speak, believing that words will save us. Yet this very instinct often undermines our influence, robbing us of one of persuasion's most potent tools, strategic silence. Few mastered this art more effectively than Steve Jobs. During his legendary product presentations, Jobs would often pause for what felt like eternities, creating anticipation so thick you could cut it with a knife. But it was in Apple's negotiations where his mastery of silence truly shone. During the development of the first iPhone, Jobs sat in a crucial meeting with potential partners. After they presented their terms, he remained silent for an excruciating 45 seconds. The discomfort in the room grew so intense that the other party began nervously adjusting their proposal, offering better terms without any prompting. Jobs understood what behavioral scientists have since confirmed. Silence creates a psychological pressure that most people find unbearable. When faced with silence, people will often reveal crucial information, modify their positions, or make concessions, not because they're pressured to, but because they're uncomfortable with the void. This wasn't just negotiation tactics. Jobs applied strategic silence across all domains of influence. In product development meetings, he would often respond to presentations with extended silence, allowing anticipation and self-doubt to drive teams toward excellence. During interviews, his strategic pauses drew out deeper, more thoughtful responses than rapid-fire questioning ever could. The science behind this is fascinating. Studies shows that while we perceive silences of 4 seconds or longer as uncomfortable, it's precisely this discomfort that makes silence such a powerful tool for influence. When we encounter silence, our brains kick into overdrive, working to make sense of the situation and often projecting our own meanings onto the void. Think of silence like gravity in conversation. Just as physical objects fall into gravitational wells, people naturally fall into conversational silences with their own thoughts, fears, and revelations. The key is learning to create and hold these spaces intentionally. This requires rewiring your relationship with silence. Most people view silence as empty space to be filled. Master persuaders understand that silence is active space where the real work of influence often happens. Observe these key moments when strategic silence becomes particularly powerful. After asking an important question, your silence signals genuine interest in the answer and creates space for deeper reflection. Following a proposal, silence allows others to fully consider implications rather than rushing to respond. During emotional moments, silence provides space for emotions to be fully felt and processed, rather than quickly covered with words. When receiving feedback, silence demonstrates receptivity and prevents defensive reactions. The application of strategic silence requires both courage and precision. It's about learning to recognize moments when silence will work more powerfully than any words you could speak. Blake, a family business mediator, faced this challenge when working with the Hendersons, a family torn apart by disagreement over their third-generation manufacturing company. Previous mediators had failed, overwhelmed by the rapid-fire accusations and counter-accusations that characterized every meeting. Blake took a different approach. Instead of trying to talk over or reason with the family's anger, she created strategic containers of silence. When emotions ran high, she would simply sit, maintaining calm eye contact and allowing the silence to do its work. In one pivotal session, after the eldest son finished an angry tirade about his father's controlling management style, Blake simply sat quietly. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Just as the discomfort peaked, the father, who had been defensive in every previous meeting, quietly admitted, "I guess I've been afraid of letting go because this business is all I know." That moment of vulnerability, made possible only by strategic silence, became the turning point in the mediation. The family began to hear each other in new ways, moving from accusation to understanding. Blake's success came from understanding that silence isn't passive. It's a powerful, active choice. She learned to recognize 3 critical moments when silence becomes particularly powerful. After high emotion, allowing feelings to settle rather than immediately pushing for resolution. Following important admissions, giving weight to significant statements rather than quickly moving on. During decision points, creating space for genuine consideration rather than pressured responses. The strategic use of silence requires practice and courage. It means developing comfort with discomfort and learning to read the different qualities of silence, whether it's thoughtful, resistant, or revealing. You can begin mastering this skill by practicing in lower stakes situations. Notice your impulse to fill conversational voids. Start building your tolerance for silence, first for a few seconds, then gradually longer. Pay attention to how others respond when you don't immediately fill the space. Remember, strategic silence isn't about being silent as much as possible. It's about recognizing those crucial moments when silence will work more powerfully than words. It's about creating space for others to move from surface reactions to deeper truths. Chapter 11. The Invisible Current. Understanding Emotional Contagion. You walk into the first room and energy surges through your body. Laughter bubbles from one corner while animated conversations flow across shared tables. Ideas spark like electricity between people, their eyes bright with engagement. Your shoulders naturally lift, your breathing deepens, and you feel an inexplicable urge to join the creative buzz filling the space. Now contrast this with entering the second room. The air feels thick, almost suffocating. Shoulders hunch over desks, faces fixed in tense frowns. The silence isn't peaceful. It's heavy with unspoken frustration. Your own muscles begin to tighten. Your breathing becomes shallow, and an inexplicable weight settles in your chest. Two rooms, two completely different emotional experiences. Yet in both cases, you didn't exchange a single word with anyone. This is the power of emotional contagion, the invisible current that flows between people, shaping behavior and outcomes before a single word is spoken. Understanding and harnessing this emotional current isn't just helpful, it's essential for anyone seeking to create positive change. Your emotional state isn't just your private experience. It's a force that ripples out to affect everyone around you. Few leaders have demonstrated this principle more powerfully than Jacinda Ardern during New Zealand's darkest hour. In March 2019, when a terrorist attack shattered the peace of Christchurch, killing 51 people at 2 mosques, the world watched to see how this young prime minister would respond. What followed was a masterclass in emotional leadership. Ardern didn't just speak words of comfort, she became a conductor of collective emotion, transforming fear and anger into unity and resolve. Within hours of the attack, she appeared wearing a hijab as a sign of respect, her face showing genuine grief, but also quiet strength. Her famous words, "They are us," didn't just express a policy position. They transmitted an emotional reality that New Zealanders could feel and embody. In Parliament, when she declared she would never speak the attacker's name, the power came not from the words themselves, but from the controlled anger and determination in her voice. She wasn't just making a statement. She was channeling and transforming the nation's emotional energy. Most remarkably, Ardern maintained this emotional presence consistently through the crisis. In every interaction, whether with grieving families, the media, or Parliament, she demonstrated that emotional contagion isn't about grand gestures, but about authentic, sustained presence. Her genuine emotions, the grief, the resolve, the compassion, created a field that others could step into, helping an entire nation process trauma and emerge stronger. The science behind emotional contagion reveals why Ardern's approach was so effective. Research shows that humans are equipped with mirror neurons that automatically reproduce the emotional states we observe in others. This isn't just metaphorical. When you see someone experiencing an emotion, your brain literally begins to mirror their neural patterns. This biological mechanism explains why one person's anxiety can infect an entire team, or why a single person's enthusiasm can elevate an entire room. It's why a leader's mood has such disproportionate impact on organizational culture, and why your own emotional state matters far more than you might think. The key insight is that emotional contagion happens whether you're conscious of it or not. The only question is whether you'll be intentional about the emotional current you create. Parker, a 5th grade teacher in an urban school, discovered this truth through necessity. His classroom was known as the challenging one, a euphemism for barely controlled chaos. He had tried every classroom management technique in the book, but nothing seemed to stick. The turning point came when Parker realized he was unconsciously absorbing and amplifying his students' scattered energy. Every morning, he walked in already tense, expecting problems. His anxiety fed their restlessness, creating a destructive feedback loop. Instead of fighting this dynamic, Parker began intentionally managing the emotional current. He started arriving early, taking 10 minutes to center himself and consciously generate the emotional state he wanted his students to embody. When students entered, he greeted each one while maintaining an internal state of calm focus. When disruptions occurred, rather than immediately reacting, he would pause, consciously shift his own emotional state, and then respond. He discovered that his students would often settle simply because he maintained his calm center. Most importantly, Parker learned to read the classroom's emotional current like a skilled sailor reads the wind. He could feel when energy was becoming scattered and would adjust his lesson pace or introduce movement breaks. When anxiety was high before tests, he would intentionally project confidence and ease. Within weeks, the same students who had been labeled challenging were being praised for their focus and engagement. Parker hadn't changed his teaching techniques or classroom rules. He had simply learned to consciously manage the emotional current. This principle applies far beyond the classroom. Whether you're leading a team, parenting children, or trying to influence any group, your emotional state is constantly broadcasting and shaping outcomes. Consider these key moments when emotional contagion has particular impact. During introductions, the emotional tone you set in the first moments of any interaction tends to persist. In times of stress, your ability to maintain emotional equilibrium becomes a stabilizing force for others. During transitions, changes naturally create emotional uncertainty that you can help navigate. In conflict situations, your emotional state can either escalate or de-escalate tension. The key is developing awareness of your own emotional broadcast and learning to consciously shape it. This doesn't mean suppressing authentic feelings. Rather, it's about being intentional about how you process and transmit them. Take time now to reflect on the emotional currents you typically create in your most important relationships and environments. Think of 3 key relationships or situations in your life. For each one, ask yourself, what emotional state do I typically bring to this situation? How does this emotional state affect others? What emotional current would be more beneficial? What specific shift in my own state would help create this? Choose one relationship or situation where shifting your emotional broadcast could make a significant difference. Commit to consciously managing your emotional state in that context for the next week, paying attention to how it affects the overall dynamic. Remember, you're always transmitting. The only question is whether you're doing it consciously or unconsciously. By developing awareness of emotional contagion, you gain access to one of the most powerful forces in human interaction. Chapter 12. The Connection Paradox. Why trying to connect makes you less connected. A groundbreaking study revealed something startling. The harder people consciously tried to connect with others, the less successful they were at forming genuine bonds. Brain scans showed that focusing on performing connection actually suppressed activity in the regions responsible for authentic social bonding. Meanwhile, those who formed the deepest connections weren't thinking about connecting at all. They were simply present and curious. This finding shatters everything we think we know about building relationships. You've probably experienced this paradox yourself. In moments when you're focused on networking or building rapport, interactions often feel forced and artificial. Yet your deepest connections likely emerge naturally, perhaps even with people you initially had no intention of becoming close to. The implications of this research extend far beyond casual social interactions. Whether you're trying to influence colleagues, build client relationships, or deepen personal connections, understanding this paradox is crucial. The very effort to connect might be what's keeping you disconnected. Jane Goodall's revolutionary work with chimpanzees provides a powerful illustration of this principle. When she first arrived at Gombe in 1960, traditional scientific wisdom demanded detached observation. Researchers were expected to maintain emotional distance and number their subjects rather than naming them. Goodall did the opposite. Instead of trying to study the chimps, she focused on simply being with them. She gave them names: David Greybeard, Flo, Flint. She allowed herself to feel genuine curiosity and empathy. Most importantly, she dropped any agenda about what she should discover or prove. This approach was initially criticized as unscientific, yet it led to unprecedented breakthroughs in our understanding of primate behavior. Goodall discovered tool use among chimps, revolutionizing our conception of what separated humans from other species. She documented complex social behaviors and emotional relationships that had never been observed by more traditional researchers. What made Goodall's approach so effective wasn't just that it yielded better scientific results, it fundamentally transformed our understanding of connection itself. She demonstrated that genuine bonds form not through technique or method, but through authentic presence and curiosity. The chimps accepted Goodall not because she used the right approach, but because she dropped all approaches. She wasn't trying to connect. She was simply being fully present with whatever emerged. This same principle explains why some people seem to effortlessly form deep connections, while others struggle despite their best efforts. The neuroscience supports this counterintuitive truth. When we're focused on performing connection, the brain's task-positive network activates, suppressing the default mode network that enables genuine social bonding. It's like trying to fall asleep by forcing yourself to sleep. The very effort prevents what you're trying to achieve. Morgan, a software engineer at a major tech company, discovered this principle through necessity. As an introvert in a client-facing role, she initially struggled watching her more outgoing colleagues seemingly build instant rapport with customers. She tried mimicking their approach, being more energetic, telling more stories, asking the standard connection-building questions. But it felt exhausting and inauthentic, and clients seemed to sense it. The turning point came during a particularly challenging client meeting. Tired of performing, Morgan simply dropped her agenda about building rapport. Instead, she became genuinely curious about the technical problem the client was facing. She stopped thinking about how she was coming across and simply engaged with real interest. To her surprise, this failed meeting became a turning point. The client later commented that it was the first time they felt truly understood by a vendor. Morgan realized that while her colleagues were skilled at surface rapport, she was building something deeper by simply being present and genuinely interested. She began applying this approach systematically, but not as a technique. Instead of preparing small talk or rapport-building questions, she prepared by becoming genuinely curious about each client's challenges. Instead of trying to appear confident or expert, she allowed herself to ask real questions and admit when she didn't know something. Within 6 months, Morgan had built stronger client relationships than many of her extroverted peers. Her client retention rate was the highest in the company. Yet she wasn't doing anything. She had simply stopped trying to connect and started being genuinely present. This principle applies far beyond professional relationships. Whether you're meeting new people, deepening existing relationships, or trying to influence others, the key is paradoxical. Stop trying to connect. This doesn't mean becoming passive or disengaged. Rather, it means shifting your focus from performing connection to being genuinely present and curious. It means dropping the mental agenda about what should happen and allowing real interaction to emerge. The brain research reveals why this works. When we stop trying to manage the interaction, the default mode network activates, enabling genuine social connection. Our mirror neurons naturally attune to others, creating authentic resonance that no technique can replicate. This explains why forced networking events often feel so awkward, while spontaneous connections form naturally in unexpected places. It's why rehearsed elevator pitches usually fall flat, while authentic expressions of interest create real engagement. The very effort to connect interferes with connection. What makes this insight so powerful is that it's accessible to everyone, regardless of personality type. You don't need to become more extroverted, learn complex social skills, or master influence techniques. You simply need to drop the effort to connect and allow your natural curiosity and presence to emerge. Your challenge for the next week is to create 3 meaningful new connections using this counterintuitive approach. But instead of trying to connect, focus on finding genuine curiosity. Before each interaction, identify something you're truly interested to learn about the other person or situation. Dropping the agenda. Release any specific outcome you're trying to achieve from the interaction. Being present. Rather than managing the interaction, simply notice what emerges when you engage with real interest. Remember, the goal isn't to achieve connection, it's to drop the very effort to connect and allow authentic engagement to naturally emerge. Chapter 13. The Daily Dance. Transforming everyday resistance into willing cooperation. You've been here before. The teenager who rolls their eyes and retreats to their room the moment you mention homework. The client who crosses their arms and finds a problem with every solution you propose. The colleague who responds to your carefully crafted presentation with, "That's not how we do things here." Each scenario different, yet all sharing the same undercurrent of resistance that leaves you feeling frustrated and powerless. These daily influence challenges can feel like pushing against an immovable wall. The harder you try, the more entrenched the opposition becomes. Traditional advice tells you to be more assertive, present better arguments, or establish your authority. Yet something inside you knows these approaches only create more resistance. What if the solution isn't about pushing harder, but about dancing differently? When Michelle Obama launched the Let's Move campaign in 2010, she faced a challenge that had defeated countless previous initiatives. Childhood obesity rates had tripled over the past 3 decades, with every previous attempt to address the crisis meeting fierce resistance from parents, food companies, and even the children themselves. The conventional approach had been to focus on statistics, warnings, and restrictive policies. Michelle Obama took a radically different path. Instead of leading with alarming obesity statistics, she started with stories about her own family's struggles with healthy eating. Rather than demonizing food companies, she invited them to be part of the solution. Most importantly, she reframed the entire conversation from deprivation to empowerment. The campaign's genius lay not in its policies, but in its approach to influence. When speaking with parents, Obama didn't lecture about nutrition. She shared her own challenges as a working mother trying to feed her children healthy meals. When addressing food companies, she didn't demand changes, but explored how healthier options could create new market opportunities. When working with schools, she didn't mandate programs, but celebrated innovative solutions already working in communities. The results were unprecedented. Major food companies voluntarily changed their recipes and portion sizes. Schools eagerly adopted new lunch programs. Parents became advocates rather than opponents. Within a few years, childhood obesity rates began declining for the first time in decades. The campaign succeeded by embodying 3 core principles of practical influence. First, Obama led with empathy rather than authority. She didn't position herself as an expert telling others what to do, but as a fellow parent sharing their struggles. This created connection where there might have been resistance. Second, she reframed the conversation from restriction to opportunity. Instead of focusing on what people should stop doing, she highlighted what they could start doing. This transformed the energy from opposition to possibility. Third, she made others partners in the solution rather than targets of change. By involving all stakeholders in developing solutions, she created willing collaboration instead of grudging compliance. These same principles can transform your daily influence challenges. Observe Jamie, a healthcare administrator facing chronically low patient compliance rates with post-discharge care instructions. The traditional approach of emphasizing risks and consequences wasn't working. Patients would nod politely in the hospital but rarely follow through at home. Jamie noticed that the few nurses with high compliance rates approached patients differently. Instead of delivering instructions, they started by asking about the patient's home situation and anticipated challenges. Rather than emphasizing medical terminology, they used the patient's own language and concerns. Most importantly, they involved family members in developing realistic care plans. Inspired by these observations, Jamie redesigned the discharge process. Instead of handing patients a standardized instruction sheet, nurses now started with simple questions. What concerns you most about managing your care at home? What support do you have available? What might get in the way? This information shaped how instructions were presented. For elderly patients living alone, care plans emphasized simple routines and connection with community services. For busy parents, instructions focused on integrating care into existing family schedules. For those with limited resources, nurses identified free or low-cost alternatives. The results were dramatic. Patient compliance rates doubled within 6 months. Emergency readmissions dropped by 40%. Most surprisingly, patient satisfaction scores soared. People felt heard and supported rather than lectured and judged. Jamie's success demonstrates how the same principles that worked on a national scale can transform individual interactions. The key lies not in better arguments or stronger authority, but in better dancing, moving with rather than against natural human patterns. This approach works because it aligns with how our brains naturally process influence. Research shows that resistance often comes not from disagreement with the message, but from feeling unheard or disrespected in the delivery. When we feel pushed, we push back. When we feel understood, we naturally open to new possibilities. The same principles that transformed Jamie's hospital can work in your daily interactions. Lead with curiosity instead of conclusion. Before presenting solutions, understand the other person's perspective and challenges. This creates openness where there might be resistance. Frame changes as additions rather than restrictions. Instead of focusing on what someone should stop doing, highlight new possibilities they can start exploring. This shifts energy from opposition to opportunity. Make others architects of change rather than targets of change. Involve them in developing solutions that work for their situation. This creates ownership instead of resistance. Chapter 14. When Opposition Becomes Opportunity. Advanced Resistance Handling. The meeting room fell silent as your carefully crafted presentation crashed against a wall of crossed arms and skeptical expressions. Despite weeks of preparation, solid data, and what you thought was an ironclad argument, the executive team's resistance was palpable. Every point you made seemed to strengthen their opposition rather than dissolve it. In that moment, you realized that everything you thought you knew about handling resistance was actually making things worse. This scenario plays out countless times each day across conference rooms, dinner tables, and community meetings. The harder we push against resistance, the more it pushes back. Traditional wisdom tells us to counter opposition with stronger arguments, more data, or increased pressure. Yet these approaches often entrench the very resistance we're trying to overcome. The story of Malala Yousafzai offers a masterclass in transforming opposition into opportunity. When the Taliban began threatening girls' education in Pakistan's Swat Valley, many responded with fear or violent resistance. Instead, 11-year-old Malala chose a different path. Rather than meeting threats with threats or hatred with hatred, she responded with unwavering commitment to education and compassion for her opponents. Even after surviving an assassination attempt, Malala's response wasn't anger or calls for revenge. Instead, she declared, "I do not even hate the Talib who shot me. Even if there is a gun in my hand and he stands in front of me, I would not shoot him." This wasn't mere pacifism. It was strategic brilliance. By refusing to mirror her opponent's tactics, she transformed what could have been a local tragedy into a global movement for education. Malala's approach demonstrates three crucial principles for handling entrenched opposition. First, she never let her opponents define the conversation. While they focused on restrictions and fear, she consistently spoke about opportunity and hope. This reframing prevented her from getting trapped in their narrative. Second, she maintained unwavering clarity about her core principles while remaining flexible about methods. This combination of principled stability and tactical adaptability made her impossible to dismiss yet difficult to effectively oppose. Third, she consistently humanized rather than demonized her opponents. By acknowledging their humanity while disagreeing with their actions, she created space for transformation rather than mere defeat. These principles find practical application in the story of Casey, a community mediator called into a neighborhood dispute that had festered for over 20 years. The conflict centered on a historic oak tree straddling two properties. One neighbor wanted it removed for safety reasons, while the other was determined to preserve it at any cost. Previous mediators had failed to resolve the situation, and the dispute had evolved into mutual harassment and legal threats. Instead of diving into arguments about tree ordinances or property rights, Casey began by asking both neighbors about their earliest memories of trees. The preservationist spoke about climbing trees with her grandfather, while the removal advocate shared stories about a storm-damaged tree that had nearly injured his child. Casey realized they weren't really fighting about a tree. They were fighting about safety, heritage, and being heard. Rather than trying to negotiate a compromise, Casey helped them explore what they each truly needed. Through careful questioning, it emerged that the preservationist mainly wanted to honor her family's environmental legacy, while the other neighbor primarily needed to feel his family was safe. With these deeper needs revealed, solutions began emerging naturally. They eventually agreed to remove the aging oak, but collaborate on planting several young trees in better locations, creating a shared neighborhood green space that would benefit future generations. The breakthrough came not from arguing about the tree, but from transforming how both parties viewed the resistance itself. By shifting from positions to principles, from past grievances to future possibilities, the very energy of opposition became fuel for creative solutions. This approach works because it aligns with how our brains process conflict. Studies shows that perceived threats activate our defensive responses, making it nearly impossible to consider new perspectives. By creating safety and acknowledging underlying needs, we bypass these defensive triggers and access more collaborative brain states. The same principles that transformed Casey's neighborhood dispute can revolutionize how you handle resistance in any situation. First, recognize that resistance usually contains valuable information about unmet needs or unexpressed concerns. Rather than trying to overcome opposition, get curious about what it's telling you. Second, shift from arguing about positions to exploring principles. People will fight to the death over positions but can often find common ground in underlying values. Third, transform the energy of opposition into fuel for creative solutions. The very passion that drives resistance can become enthusiasm for new possibilities when properly redirected. Map your most challenging resistance patterns. Where do you typically encounter the strongest opposition? What automatic responses might be intensifying rather than dissolving that resistance? What deeper needs might be hiding behind surface conflicts? Your breakthrough awaits not in finding better arguments, but in fundamentally transforming how you view and respond to opposition itself. Every act of resistance contains within it the seeds of potential transformation, if you know how to nurture them. What deeply held need might be driving your most persistent opponent? Your next conversation could be the beginning of an unexpected breakthrough. Chapter 15. The Ripple Effect. Creating influence that outlasts you. 20 years from now, when people reflect on how you shaped their lives, what stories will they tell? Not about the meetings you won or the deals you closed, but about how your presence transformed their understanding of what's possible. This isn't just a thought experiment. It's the ultimate measure of your influence. Most people focus on immediate impact, trying to win the moment. But true influence isn't measured in moments. It compounds across years, decades, and generations. Like a stone dropped in still water, authentic influence creates ripples that continue long after the initial impact, touching lives you'll never meet in ways you couldn't predict. Viktor Frankl's story powerfully illustrates this principle. As a psychiatrist imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps, he could have focused solely on immediate survival. Instead, he observed how some prisoners maintained their inner dignity and helped others despite unimaginable circumstances. He noticed that those who found meaning in their suffering, who lived for something beyond themselves, were most likely to survive both physically and spiritually. This observation led to his development of logotherapy and his seminal work, Man's Search for Meaning. But Frankl's true influence wasn't in his therapeutic technique or even his best-selling book. It was in demonstrating how finding meaning transforms suffering into purpose. Decades later, his insights continue shaping lives across cultures and contexts, from addiction recovery programs to corporate leadership development. Frankl's influence grew because he focused not on controlling others, but on understanding and sharing profound human truths. He didn't try to build a movement. He simply illuminated principles that resonated with fundamental human needs. His impact compounded because his insights spoke to something timeless in the human experience. The same principles that made Frankl's influence endure can transform how you impact others. First, focus on principles rather than personalities. When you help someone understand a universal truth rather than just follow your direction, they can apply that insight in countless situations you'll never see. Second, empower others to become sources of influence themselves. True influence multiplies when those you impact become capable of positively affecting others. Third, create environments that nurture growth rather than dependency. The most powerful influence often comes from shaping the conditions that allow others to discover their own strength. Consider the story of Avery, a senior engineer who never held an official leadership position but transformed her industry through subtle yet persistent influence. Rather than focusing on climbing the corporate ladder, she invested in mentoring junior developers, teaching them not just coding skills, but how to think about technology's human impact. Avery noticed that many talented developers struggled with imposter syndrome and fear of making mistakes. Instead of just offering technical solutions, she created a weekly failure celebration, where team members shared their biggest mistakes and what they learned. This simple practice gradually transformed the team's culture from fear-driven perfectionism to courageous innovation. Years later, her protégés had spread across dozens of companies, each carrying forward not just technical skills, but a philosophy of psychological safety and continuous learning. Without holding any formal authority, Avery had helped reshape how entire organizations approach software development, not through mandate, but through mentorship that empowered others to become positive influences themselves. The key to Avery's compound influence was focusing on transforming mindsets rather than just behaviors. She understood that teaching someone how to code has limited impact, but teaching them how to learn, grow, and lift others creates endless possibilities for positive change. Your influence can create similar compound effects when you shift focus from immediate impact to lasting transformation. Instead of asking, "How can I get what I want?" ask, "How can I help others discover their own power?" Rather than trying to be the source of all solutions, focus on building others' capacity to solve problems and help those around them. What would change if you approached each interaction as a chance to plant seeds that might flower years from now? How might you structure conversations differently if you were thinking about their 10th ripple rather than their first splash? Consider this reflection exercise. Identify 3 people you interact with regularly whose growth you could nurture. What one principle or insight, if they truly understood and embodied it, would most powerfully transform their future impact on others? How could you help them discover this truth for themselves rather than just telling them? Your most profound influence may be invisible to you, rippling outward through lives you'll never see. But by consciously focusing on creating lasting positive change rather than temporary compliance, you set in motion waves of influence that continue growing long after you've moved on. What seed of transformation will you plant today? Conclusion. Remember that moment at the beginning of this audiobook when you felt stuck, trying to force influence through sheer willpower and technique? Look how far you've come. The person who started this journey seeking tactics for persuasion has transformed into someone who understands that true influence flows naturally from authentic connection and inner mastery. You'll face challenges as you implement these changes. There will be moments when pressure tempts you to fall back on manipulation or force. Old habits of trying to control outcomes will resurface. But now you understand that temporary compliance gained through pressure costs more than it's worth. This isn't the end of your journey. It's the beginning of a new way of moving through the world. Each day brings fresh opportunities to practice these principles, deepen your understanding, and expand your positive impact. Every interaction becomes a chance to create the kind of influence that outlasts your presence. This transformation isn't just about getting better results, though you will. It's about becoming someone who elevates every room you enter, who brings out the best in others without effort, who creates positive change that continues rippling outward long after you've moved on. The real power of these principles lies not in what they help you achieve, but in who they help you become. As you integrate them more deeply, you'll find yourself creating the kind of impact that transforms not just individual interactions, but entire relationships, teams, and communities. Thank you for listening and for investing in yourself. I believe in you. Your potential is endless. Now go out there and create the life you deserve.